Welcome to the War Vault, where we dive into history's greatest battles. Imagine a young man, barely 20 years old, standing over the body of his assassinated father. The kingdom is in chaos. Enemies surround the borders. Rivals plot to seize the throne. Within 2 years, this young man will have secured his kingdom, crushed 2 rebellions, and begun a campaign of conquest that will take him to the edge of the known world. Within 10 years, he will have destroyed the most powerful empire on earth. Within 13 years, he will rule from Greece to India, commanding an empire larger than any before it. His name will become legend. Alexander the Great. He conquered more territory in a shorter time than anyone in history. He never lost a battle. He destroyed cities that defied him and founded cities that bear his name to this day. He spread Greek culture across 3 continents, creating a fusion of civilizations that shaped the ancient world for centuries. And then, at the age of 32, he died, leaving behind an empire with no clear successor, a legend that would inspire conquerors for 2,000 years, and a question that historians still debate. How did one man, in just over a decade, conquer the known world? This is not a story of luck. It is a story of genius, ruthlessness, charisma, and an ambition so vast it could not be contained by the borders of the ancient world. This is the story of Alexander the Great. To understand how Alexander conquered the world, we must first understand where he came from. Alexander was born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of Macedon, a kingdom on the northern edge of the Greek world. Macedon was not considered truly Greek by the city-states to the south. Athens and Sparta saw the Macedonians as semi-barbarians, rough highlanders who spoke Greek with a thick accent, and whose kings ruled not through democracy, but through military power and personal charisma. Alexander's father, Philip II, had transformed Macedon from a backwater kingdom into the dominant power in Greece. Philip was a military genius who revolutionized warfare. He created the Macedonian Phalanx, a formation of infantry armed with long pikes called sarissas, up to 18 feet long. Packed tightly together, the Phalanx presented a wall of spear points that was nearly impossible to break. Philip also developed the companion cavalry, elite horsemen who served as shock troops, smashing into enemy flanks while the Phalanx held the center. By the time Alexander was born, Philip had already begun his conquest of Greece. One by one, the Greek city-states fell under Macedonian control. In 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip crushed a coalition of Athens and Thebes. Greece was his. Philip planned to invade Persia next, to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor and take revenge for the Persian invasions of Greece 150 years earlier. But in 336 BC, at a wedding feast, Philip was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards. The killer's motives remain unclear: personal revenge, political conspiracy, or both. What is clear is that Philip's death threw Macedon into crisis. And into that crisis stepped his son, Alexander. Alexander was 20 years old when his father died. He had been groomed for kingship his entire life. His mother, Olympias, was a fierce, ambitious woman from the royal house of Epirus. She filled Alexander's head with tales of his divine ancestry. She claimed descent from Achilles, the greatest hero of the Trojan War. Alexander believed it. He slept with a copy of Homer's Iliad under his pillow, annotated by his tutor. That tutor was Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophers in history. For 3 years, Aristotle taught Alexander philosophy, science, medicine, and literature. He instilled in Alexander a love of Greek culture and a belief that Greeks were superior to all other peoples, a belief Alexander would carry with him across Asia. But Alexander was not just a scholar, he was a warrior. At the age of 16, while Philip was away campaigning, Alexander was left in charge of Macedon. When a Thracian tribe rebelled, Alexander led an army, crushed the revolt, and founded a city, Alexandropolis, in his own honor. At 18, Alexander commanded the companion cavalry at the Battle of Chaeronea. His charge broke the Theban sacred band, an elite unit that had never been defeated, and won the battle. Philip recognized his son's talent, but also feared his ambition. The relationship between father and son was complicated, marked by rivalry and suspicion. When Philip took a new wife, a Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, Alexander and his mother Olympias were sidelined. At the wedding feast, a drunken argument erupted. Philip drew his sword on Alexander. Alexander fled into exile. They reconciled, but the rift never fully healed. Then came the assassination. Within days, Alexander moved decisively. Potential rivals were eliminated. The assassin was killed before he could be questioned. Olympias had Philip's new wife and her infant son murdered. Alexander was declared king by the Macedonian army. He was 20, untested, and surrounded by enemies. The first test came immediately. The Greek city-states, seeing Philip's death as an opportunity, revolted. Thebes and Athens led the rebellion. In the north, barbarian tribes invaded Macedonian territory. Alexander's generals advised caution. The young king ignored them. He marched north with lightning speed, crushing the barbarian invasions in a series of brutal campaigns. Then he turned south. In 335 BC, Thebes declared independence and besieged the Macedonian garrison in the city. Alexander appeared outside Thebes with an army so quickly that the Thebans thought it was impossible. He offered terms, surrender, and the city would be spared. Thebes refused. Alexander's army stormed the city. What followed was a massacre. 6,000 Thebans were killed. 30,000 were sold into slavery. The city was razed to the ground, every building destroyed except the temples and the house of the poet Pindar, whom Alexander admired. Only one city in all of Greece was left as a smoking ruin as a warning. Defy Alexander, and you will be annihilated. The other Greek cities got the message. No one else rebelled. With Greece secured, Alexander turned his attention to the east, to Persia. The Persian Empire was the greatest power in the world. It stretched from Egypt to India, from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. It had more soldiers, more wealth, and more resources than any kingdom in history. Its king, Darius III, commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Against this colossus, Alexander could field perhaps 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. The odds were absurd, but Alexander did not care about odds. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, with his army. He landed at Troy, the site of the legendary Trojan War. Alexander visited the tomb of Achilles, his hero, and declared that Achilles was fortunate to have had Homer to immortalize his deeds. Alexander intended to surpass him. The first battle came quickly. Persian satraps, regional governors, had gathered an army to stop Alexander at the Granicus River. The Persians held the high ground on the far bank. Crossing the river under fire would be suicide. Alexander's general Parmenion advised waiting, finding another crossing. Alexander refused. He would attack immediately. He led the companion cavalry into the river himself, charging up the opposite bank under a hail of arrows and javelins. It was madness, and it worked. Alexander's cavalry smashed into the Persian line. The Macedonian phalanx followed. The Persians broke and fled. Alexander had won his first battle in Asia, but he had nearly died doing it. In the melee, a Persian noble struck Alexander's helmet with a sword, denting it. As the Persian raised his weapon for a killing blow, one of Alexander's companions, Clytus the Black, cut the man down, saving Alexander's life. It would not be the last time Alexander's recklessness nearly cost him his life. After the Granicus, Alexander marched down the coast of Asia Minor, liberating Greek cities from Persian rule. Most cities surrendered. Those that resisted were besieged and taken. In late 333 BC, Alexander faced his first true test. Darius III himself had taken the field with the main Persian army. The Battle of Issus is one of the most famous in history. Darius commanded perhaps 100,000 men. Alexander had 40,000. The battlefield was a narrow coastal plain, hemmed in by mountains and the sea. Darius had chosen the ground carefully, thinking the narrow space would neutralize Alexander's superior tactics. He was wrong. Alexander arranged his army with the phalanx in the center and the companion cavalry, led by Alexander himself, on the right. As the battle began, Alexander did what he always did. He found the weak point in the enemy line and charged it with overwhelming force. Leading the companions, Alexander smashed into the left side of the Persian line, heading straight for Darius. The Persian king, seeing the Macedonian cavalry cutting through his guards, panicked. He turned his chariot and fled. The Persian army, seeing their king run, disintegrated. It became a rout. Thousands of Persians were slaughtered as they fled. Darius's camp was captured, along with his mother, wife, and children. Alexander treated them with respect, a gesture that shocked the ancient world. But the message was clear. Darius had fled. Alexander had won, and the aura of Persian invincibility was shattered. After Issus, Alexander did not pursue Darius immediately. Instead, he turned south toward the Mediterranean coast. His strategy was methodical. He would conquer the entire eastern Mediterranean, cutting off Persian naval power before marching into the heart of the empire. City after city fell. Some surrendered, others resisted and were destroyed. The most famous resistance came from Tyre, a wealthy Phoenician city built on an island half a mile offshore. Tyre believed itself impregnable. Alexander disagreed. The Siege of Tyre lasted 7 months. Alexander's engineers built a causeway, a massive land bridge from the mainland to the island. The Tyrians attacked the causeway with ships, burning the siege engines. Alexander rebuilt it, wider and stronger. He gathered a fleet, defeated the Tyrian navy, and surrounded the island. Siege towers taller than the city walls were rolled up the causeway. Battering rams pounded the fortifications. Finally, in July 332 BC, the walls were breached. Macedonian troops poured in. The Tyrians fought street by street, house by house. When it was over, 8,000 Tyrians were dead. 2,000 were crucified on the beach. 30,000 were sold into slavery. Tyre had defied Alexander. Tyre ceased to exist. The siege demonstrated two things: Alexander's engineering brilliance and his absolute ruthlessness. From Tyre, Alexander marched to Egypt. The Egyptians, who hated Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. Alexander was crowned pharaoh and declared the son of the god Amun-Ra. Whether Alexander believed it or not, he encouraged the belief. Divinity was useful. In Egypt, Alexander founded the city of Alexandria, the first and most famous of the many cities he would name after himself. It would become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, home to the legendary Library of Alexandria. But Alexander did not linger. In 331 BC, he marched east to finish what he had started. Darius was raising another army, the largest yet. The final confrontation was coming. The Battle of Gaugamela, fought on October 1st, 331 BC, was the decisive battle of Alexander's conquest. Darius had learned from his mistakes. He chose a vast open plain in northern Mesopotamia, near modern-day Iraq, where his numerical superiority could be fully deployed. He commanded perhaps 100,000 infantry and 40,000 cavalry, including elite units like the Immortals and war chariots with scythed wheels designed to cut through infantry. Alexander had 47,000 men. Once again, he was outnumbered more than 2 to 1. Darius had even leveled and smoothed the battlefield to give his chariots maximum effectiveness. The two armies faced each other at dawn. Darius placed himself in the center, surrounded by his best troops. Alexander, as always, positioned himself on the right with the companion cavalry. As the battle began, Darius launched his war chariots. They thundered toward the Macedonian phalanx. But Alexander's men were ready. The phalanx opened gaps, allowing the chariots to pass through harmlessly. Those that didn't were stopped by javelins and pulled down. The much-feared chariots were neutralized in minutes. Then Alexander saw his opportunity. As Darius's cavalry engaged on the flanks, a gap opened in the Persian center-left. Alexander, with the instinct that defined his genius, charged. Leading the companions in a wedge formation, Alexander drove straight for the gap. The Macedonian cavalry smashed through, wheeling toward Darius in the center. Once again, Darius panicked. He fled the battlefield. His army, seeing the king run for the second time, collapsed. It became a massacre. Tens of thousands of Persians were killed as they fled. Darius escaped, but his empire was finished. After Gaugamela, the Persian Empire fell apart. Alexander marched to Babylon. The city surrendered without a fight, welcoming Alexander as a liberator. He entered the city in triumph, the conqueror of the greatest empire on earth. From Babylon, Alexander moved to the Persian heartland. Susa, one of Persia's capitals, surrendered and opened its treasuries. Alexander seized 50,000 talents of gold and silver, unimaginable wealth. Next was Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, symbol of Persian power. In January 330 BC, Alexander entered Persepolis. What happened next remains controversial. According to some accounts, Alexander allowed his troops to sack the city. Thousands of Persians were killed. The city was looted. Then, the great palace of Persepolis was burned. Some say it was deliberate revenge for the Persian burning of Athens 150 years earlier. Others claim it was a drunken accident during a feast. Either way, the greatest palace in the world was reduced to ashes. The message to Persia was clear. The old order was dead. Alexander was now king of Asia. But the campaign was not over. Darius was still alive, fleeing east with the remnants of his army. Alexander pursued. He marched through the harsh Iranian plateau, moving with astonishing speed. In July 330 BC, Alexander's scouts found Darius. He was dead, murdered by his own satraps, who hoped to win favor with Alexander by delivering the Persian king's body. They were wrong. Alexander was furious. Darius had been his enemy, but he was also a king. Regicide was unforgivable. Alexander had the traitors hunted down and executed. He gave Darius a royal burial, and then he declared himself the rightful successor to the Persian throne. But Alexander did not stop. He could have returned to Macedon, declared victory, and ruled the largest empire in history. Instead, he marched east. For the next 7 years, Alexander campaigned in Central Asia and India, conquering territories the Persians had never fully controlled. This phase of the campaign was the hardest. The eastern satrapies of the Persian Empire were wild, mountainous, and inhabited by fierce tribes who had no intention of submitting to a foreign king. Alexander fought a grinding guerrilla war in what is now Afghanistan and Central Asia. Cities were besieged in the mountains. Tribes were hunted through deserts. The fighting was brutal, and for the first time, Alexander faced sustained resistance. In Bactria and Sogdia, two eastern regions, a local warlord named Spitamenes led a rebellion that lasted 2 years. Alexander's patience wore thin. Villages that supported the rebels were burned. Populations were massacred. The savagery increased. Alexander's character was changing. The young idealist who had spared Darius's family was becoming a paranoid tyrant. In 328 BC, during a drunken feast at Samarkand, an argument erupted. Clitus the Black, the man who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, criticized Alexander's increasing adoption of Persian customs. He accused Alexander of abandoning Macedonian traditions and becoming a Persian despot. Alexander, drunk and enraged, grabbed a spear and killed Clytus. The next day, sober and horrified by what he had done, Alexander locked himself in his tent for 3 days, refusing to eat or speak. But the moment revealed the truth. Alexander was no longer the boy king who had crossed into Asia. He was becoming something else. In 327 BC, Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush mountains and invaded India. His target was the kingdom of Porus, a powerful Indian king who ruled the region of Punjab in what is now Pakistan. In 326 BC, the two armies met at the Hydaspes River. It was the monsoon season. The river was swollen and fast-flowing. On the far bank, King Porus waited with an army of 30,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, 300 war chariots, and 200 war elephants. The elephants terrified the Macedonians. They had never faced anything like them. Horses panicked at the sight and smell of the massive beasts. Alexander devised a brilliant plan. He divided his army, leaving part of it visible on the near bank to pin Porus in place. Then, in the middle of a stormy night, Alexander led a force upriver, crossed at a hidden ford, and fell on Porus's flank at dawn. The Battle of the Hydaspes was Alexander's masterpiece. Despite the elephants, despite the rain and mud, Alexander's cavalry and phalanx won. Porus fought to the last, mounted on his war elephant, wounded and defiant. When captured and brought before Alexander, the Indian king was asked how he wished to be treated. Porus replied, "Like a king." Alexander was impressed. He restored Porus to his throne as a vassal and ally. But the cost had been high. Many Macedonians were killed or wounded, and the soldiers were exhausted. They had been campaigning for 8 years, marching thousands of miles through deserts, mountains, and jungles. They wanted to go home. Alexander had other plans. He wanted to continue east, to the Ganges River, to conquer the rest of India, to reach the eastern edge of the world. But at the Hyphasis River, his army refused. For the first time in his life, Alexander's men said no. His officers, led by Conus, spoke for the troops. They were tired. They had fought enough. They wanted to see their families again. Alexander raged. He sulked in his tent for 3 days, hoping the men would change their minds. They did not. Finally, Alexander relented. He agreed to turn back. But he never forgave them for denying him his ultimate conquest. The return journey was a nightmare. Alexander decided to march back through the Gedrosian Desert in what is now southern Iran and Pakistan, one of the harshest deserts in the world. It was a disastrous decision. Heat, thirst, and starvation killed thousands. Entire units were lost. When the army finally staggered out of the desert, perhaps a quarter of the men were dead. Historians still debate why Alexander chose this route. Was it hubris? A desire to match the legendary Queen Semiramis, who had supposedly crossed the same desert? Or was it punishment for his soldiers' refusal to march further east? And whatever the reason, the desert nearly destroyed the army that had conquered the world. In 324 BC, Alexander returned to Babylon. He had been gone for over a decade. In that time, he had conquered an empire stretching from Greece to India, over 2 million square miles, the largest the world had ever seen. But the empire was unstable. Satraps in distant provinces had grown corrupt or rebellious, assuming Alexander would never return. He purged them ruthlessly. He also began planning new campaigns. He wanted to conquer Arabia. He wanted to march west, to Carthage and Rome. He dreamed of ruling the entire world, but his body was failing. Years of constant warfare, injuries, fevers, and heavy drinking had taken their toll. In June 323 BC, after a prolonged banquet, Alexander fell ill. For 10 days, he lay in bed, burning with fever. His generals gathered, asking who should succeed him. Alexander, barely able to speak, reportedly said, "To the strongest." On June 10th or 11th, 323 BC, Alexander the Great died. He was 32 years old. The cause of death remains debated. Malaria, typhoid, poisoning, alcohol, or a combination. His body was so well preserved that some suspected poison. Others said it was divine. His death plunged the empire into chaos. Alexander had no clear heir. His half-brother was mentally disabled. His wife Roxana was pregnant, but had not yet given birth. Alexander's generals, the Diadochi, began fighting for control. The wars of the Diadochi lasted for decades, tearing the empire apart. Eventually, it split into several kingdoms: the Seleucid Empire in Asia, Ptolemaic Egypt, Macedon, and smaller states. The empire Alexander built did not survive him, but his legacy did. Alexander spread Greek culture across 3 continents. The cities he founded, over 20 named Alexandria, became centers of Greek learning. Greek became the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Greek art, architecture, philosophy, and science fused with local traditions, creating what historians call Hellenistic civilization. This fusion shaped the ancient world for centuries. The Library of Alexandria, The Pharos lighthouse, the philosophy of the Stoics and Epicureans, all emerged from the world Alexander created. His conquests also connected east and west. Trade routes that had been dangerous or closed became safe highways. Silk, spices, and ideas flowed between Europe and Asia. The cultural exchange enriched both. Alexander also changed warfare forever. His use of combined arms, coordinating infantry, cavalry, and siege engines became the standard. His emphasis on speed and decisive action influenced military leaders for millennia. Napoleon studied Alexander's campaigns. So did Julius Caesar, who wept when he saw a statue of Alexander, realizing he had achieved so little by the age Alexander had conquered the world. Generals in World War II still read accounts of Alexander's battles, but Alexander's legacy is complex. He was a genius, but also a tyrant. He spread culture, but also destruction. He liberated some cities and annihilated others. He treated some enemies with honor and slaughtered others without mercy. He inspired loyalty so fierce that men followed him to the edge of the world, yet he murdered friends in drunken rages. He claimed to bring civilization, yet left behind a trail of corpses, enslaved populations, and burned cities. Was Alexander great? By the standards of his time, unquestionably. He conquered more than anyone before him. He never lost a battle. He founded cities that lasted centuries. He changed the course of history. But greatness and goodness are not the same. Alexander was ruthless, paranoid, and driven by an ambition that consumed him. He could not stop. Even after conquering the known world, he wanted more, and perhaps that is the real tragedy of Alexander. He conquered everything, and it was not enough. He stood at the edge of the world, master of an empire larger than any before, and still he was unsatisfied. There was always another horizon, another enemy, another conquest. He could not rest. He did not know how. So he kept marching, kept fighting, kept pushing himself and his men beyond human limits, until his body gave out and he died at 32, the greatest conqueror in history, but a man who never found what he was looking for. The story of Alexander is the story of ambition without limits, of genius without restraint, of power without satisfaction. He conquered the known world, but in the end, he could not conquer himself. And so the question remains, how did Alexander conquer the world? Through brilliance? Yes. Through courage? Certainly. Through ruthlessness? Without doubt. But also through something darker, a hunger that could never be filled, a need to prove himself that was never satisfied. He wanted to be greater than Achilles, greater than Heracles, greater than all the heroes of legend. And he succeeded. But the cost was his life, his sanity, and ultimately the empire he built. Alexander the Great conquered the known world, but the known world could not contain him. And so he burned bright, brief, and brilliant, a comet across the ancient sky. And when he died, an era died with him.